Welcome everyone to our webinar today, wrapping up RATOM, a summary and lessons learned from the review, appraisal, and triage of mail project. If anybody wants to, you can put your name and your institution in the chat box just so we can see who is with us here today. So Lisa, welcome. I'm Jamie Patrick Burns at the State Archives of North Carolina. I'll be moderating today. And just a little note beforehand on our upcoming webinars. We have in May, Building a National Finding Aid Network update, and our June webinar for COSA is Building Your Resume for the Digital Era. We'll take a break during the summer months and then resume the webinars in the fall, so stay tuned for those. And you can always take a look at our resource center that has resources for electronic records from produced by COSA and also produced by all of our different state archives. And one more note to take a look at our SERI online recordings. One example is FAQs on BitRot, and the YouTube channel also has past webinars and other informational videos. So please take a look if you would like. So today's presenters, we have Christopher Cal Lee. He's a professor at the School of Information and Library Science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He teaches courses and workshops in archives and records management, understanding information technology for managing digital collections, and adapting digital forensics methods to support curation of foreign digital materials. His primary research focus is the long-term curation of digital collections. Cal has served as principal investigator and co-principal investigator of numerous digital curation research and education projects. He's a fellow of the Society of American Archivists and recently completed his term as editor of American Archivist. Next, we have Sangeeta Desai. Camille Tyndall-Watson is the co-principal investigator on the RATOM grant, and she's unable to join us today, and Sangeeta is graciously taking her place. Sangeeta is the Systems Integration Librarian at the State Archives of North Carolina and serves as the State Archives, North Carolina State Archives technical lead on the RATOM grant. She's responsible for managing and providing support for the various digital preservation platforms used by the State Archives. Cam Woods is a research scientist at the UNC School of Information and Library Science, where he serves as a technical lead for the RATOM project. Previously, Cam worked as the technical and software development lead for the BitCurator family of projects. And just as a reminder, if you could please hold questions until the end, you can feel free to put your questions in the chat box at any time. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Cal.
Great, thank you. So I'll just start out by saying I'm always excited to be able to discuss this project. I think it's a really exciting intersection of research development and, I'm sorry, is this sounding bad to people? No, does my voice sound okay?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes, it sounds good.
Okay, sorry about that. It just sounds odd to me, but I'll just keep moving on. Anyway, it's just been a really exciting intersection of activities that have been happening in the Research Triangle area, the sort of Piedmont area of North Carolina, with UNC being in Chapel Hill and the State Archives, where the staff there have been leading the country in many ways, I think, on work with the electronic records. And so we could kind of join forces on this project that's about software development, but a lot more than that, I think, also. So the primary motivation for a lot of this, the sort of broader picture, is thinking about how we address selection and appraisal. So I'm thinking of this in very, archival terms, that we've made a lot of advances. I'll presumptuously say we, right? The archival profession has made a lot of advances in softwares to support arrangement and description, aspects of digital preservation like checksums and replicating files. And, so we've made a lot of progress, but it really seems to me over the years that selection and appraisal, which we all know is so core to the professional activities, isn't really very adequately addressed with software support. And I think there are a variety of reasons for that I would speculate. One being that it's a relatively diffuse activity, especially in a digital environment. You essentially learn more about the collection as you dig into it in a way that allows you to, like you essentially can't separate out the various activities from appraisal. But in any case, we think it's a very promising thing to approach because essentially it's pattern matching, right? So the very high level pattern matching that a human archivist does is clearly something that we're not trying to replicate, but the very low level things that essentially can be automated because they have distinct patterns, it would be great for us to do that, right? So essentially there are also ideas of timelining and visualizations. How do we help people make decisions in selection appraisal? And as you'll see, one of our use cases that's very important to the state archives is also review for public access, right? If you get a FOIA request, whatever the equivalent of FOIA is in your state, you know, essentially, how can you be responsive to that if you have this avalanche of email that you have to try to investigate? So why look at email? I probably don't need to justify it to this crowd, right? I think a lot of people outside of state government think that email is just passe and not really something to think about, even though if they reflect on it, so much of their activity, so much of the substrate of our activities is built into email, even if we now use a lot of other media as well. So we have, you know, hundreds of billions of messages being generated every day. Obviously, most of it is garbage. A lot more of it, I'm sorry, a smaller portion, but also a significant portion is, you know, routine activities that don't need to be documented. I mean, we all know these kind of things in terms of long-term or short-term retention value, right? And so this is another area where there's been a lot of great activity in the past few years, thanks, at least in large part, to an infusion of attention that the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation is giving to. Will in the end, it answer questions about how work might, for example, relate to other projects, you know, EPAD or things that people have heard about, because we've done a lot of conversations with the partners in all of those activities as well. So RATOM is review, appraisal, and triage of mail. The idea for RATOM as the acronym is essentially a backronym because it seemed fun to give some kind of nod to Ray Tomlinson, who was very pivotal in the generation of kind of email as a form of correspondence, you know, electronic communication through the network as a message, basically. It also conveniently stands for review, appraisal, and triage of mail. And so the idea is to use things like natural language processing tools that we've played around with, or, you know, more than played around with, really demonstrated the value of in previous projects. We're looking at how can we apply those things to email, natural language processing being things like identifying named entities, patterns that you can identify as language as opposed to just words. And also machine learning, which is something that we've made some advances on applying. And supporting what the State Archives of North Carolina really continues to talk about is iterative processing. It reflects what I was saying before, that it's really hard to disentangle these things. So you would really need to think about, how do I discover aspects of the collection in the act of trying to determine, do I even need to retain it? Do I need to set it aside to review for sensitivity? These are all the kinds of use cases that we're really trying to support in the project. Oh, my apologies. I'm just trying to click. So this is our team. Again, this is a really exciting thing to me because we've been, you know, peers and really respected and worked in some ways with each other over the years, but it's great to have this intersection between the School of Information and Library Science and the State Archives of North Carolina. So essentially, you've been introduced to several of us, but just again, quickly, I have served as the principal investigator. Camille Tyndall-Watson at the State Archives has served as the co-PI. Alicia Kinder was our project manager. Jamie Patrick Burns, Sangeeta Desai, have been working on a variety of aspects of testing out the software, figuring out how workflows would really work in the State Archives. Cam, as you've heard, is the sort of technical lead who's always really overseen what's practical, what's really solid technically for us to make these kind of decisions. And I'll acknowledge also that Antoine de Torse has really added to that team by having a very, very close attention to quality control and things like that. So I feel very confident about the quality of the software that we produced. And then we've worked with Cactus, which completes the triangle of Raleigh, Chapel Hill, and Durham, because they're a company in Durham that has helped us with the web interface that you're going to hear about a little bit later. So a very quick overview of the software, and then we're going to get into a little bit more of the detail. I would again reiterate what you heard before is please do at any time throw something into the chat, right? Because our whole team is here in this session. So if you have a question, it's not going to be distracting to the speaker. So feel free to use the chat however you'd like. So the development to date, a big part of the work that we've done has been lib-ratom. So that's, lib as in a library of software, and then ratom for our project. And a big part of what we've developed is supporting a workflow that starts from PST, OST, mbox email, which if you've worked with email, I think in a state government context should sound very familiar to you, right? Because this is true in the public and the private sector, very often PST files get passed around. That becomes the email that you really need to look at. And the tools for that have been out there. We've got Emailchemy. There are all kinds of things that you can string together to work with email. One of the things we've really been trying to do is build this kind of reference base of open source software that's very solid that you can build from to do each of these kinds of things. And so you'll hear more about that when Cam talks about the design. We essentially bring together a lot of Python scripts and different things that are out there. One important one is libpff, which processes the PST files. It was developed in the digital forensics, like straight up digital forensics, not our pretend digital forensics world for pulling things out quickly and effectively from PST files and other associated formats. And so we're really taking advantage of that. That's a huge thing you get from open source software, right? We didn't have to get permission for that. We didn't have to contract to have it developed, but it's very, very solid code that's relied on by many people. We use Spacey that is there for natural language processing, and essentially then we have a lot of software that brings it all together and also really supports scalability. So you can run it on a smaller machine, but it might be painfully slow. If you give it more computing power, it really scales up very well, which is a consideration for a lot of state archives. If you're going from testing out the software with 20 email messages to now I've got 400 million messages, right? Is it really going to scale? And I can say this software is very, very scalable. So we've built also this iterative processing web tool. I'm only going to touch on this briefly because both of these things will be presented in much more detail later in this session. But essentially the idea here, I've shown you what I would say very powerful. I feel like I can brag about it because Cam and Antoine developed the software, not me. But very solid software and very reusable software to do a lot of tasks with email. What you're seeing now is the iterative processing interface that's based on web technology, right? It's based on opening it in a browser, and you can take the output from the lib-ratom tools that go very quickly through and tell you how many email attachments or pull out things from, from the headers or whatever it might be. And then you can apply this tool that allows you to basically group and cluster and tag, where you could look and say, I want to review these for whether they're open or closed records. And you can kind of do them at the aggregate level, you can do them at the item level, and then you can try to apply it based on the patterns that have been identified. And that's some of the things that you'll see later. The technology underneath is natural language processing, which means, again, that it's treating language as different from just a stream of text. And so it can break down text in ways that it can differentiate types of entities like people, places, organizations. And so it makes its best effort to identify those, and then you can use those in those kind of tasks in the iterative processing interface. For two main environments that we're thinking of, there's two use cases. One, again, is for overall review, whether it's for retention or for sensitivity, right, of the email upon first encountering it. And then the second is being responsive to open records requests, right? Because we know that can be an incredible challenge when you have very limited, kind of limited tools, limited staff time, and unreasonable, perhaps, requests for what you're supposed to be providing. Or maybe not unreasonable, but just very overwhelming, I should say. What I'm going to do is hand this over to Cam, who's going to talk a little bit more detail about when we say CLI here, that means command line interface. So I would just preface what Cam's going to say to remind you that what we foresee is an end user being either in your own environment for how you're dealing with digital materials, or something like that web interface when you're actually doing the processing. He's going to show you the underlying tools that if you're somebody who's going to be building and maintaining the software, or somebody who's going to build off of it, are really fundamental. But I don't want people to be frightened by the idea that what we're presenting is what we're expecting to be the user interface for most people, right? You're building off of this software in a variety of ways, including what you're going to hear from the state archives later on. So sorry, that's enough of a preface, and now I'm handing it over to Cam. Oh, sorry.
Cam has not been able to get in yet.
Sorry.
He's still working on it.
It's cool. So I'm not currently handing over to Cam, but I will if he's able to join us. And it's certainly fine. We have spent so much time working on these projects together that we all are pretty familiar with what we've been doing. So using LibRATOM with the command line interface. Sorry, and I should have noticed that he wasn't on yet. That's my fault. Using LibRATOM with the command line interface. The idea here is that, and anybody who's experienced the software from the Bit Curator kind of series of software that was referenced in the introductions earlier, we have a very similar kind of philosophy. You provide an end user environment that's, I mean, nothing is just point and click, but it's fairly usable. You click on folders, you open things. There are graphic user interfaces for a lot of the tasks, to also having a really robust set of underlying tools that can be called at the command line. And that's really what can make software more sustainable and useful, because as your needs or technologies change, it's much easier to adapt it to those. So our entire design philosophy for the output from these tools is that they run very, very quickly whenever possible, right? To just do basic characterization of the email, how many messages there are, subject lines and things like that. And then you can basically make determinations about whether you want to crank it up and analyze attachments, or just extract attachments to a folder and then look at them separately. All of those things can be done, but we start from the base level of just triage and review. Like, how do I figure out what's here, essentially? And so all of those tools run in the background, either with you typing or with a script invoking them. And that's the ideal, right? Software is making these commands for you, and then you see a graphic user interface. What it essentially does is write the output to a very simple structure, which is an SQLite database. And what it does then is make that very software independent, because when it writes to that database, as long as you have software that can issue SQL queries, and I guarantee you, no matter what environment you are, if you have at least a few people working on software, you have some of these. Actually, if you use a Mac, you have a huge number of them just running in the background. So essentially what we do is identify entities. So that means what I was saying before: people, places, organizations. So it's actually able to differentiate from something you wouldn't have with a simple string, which is, Bush Senior the president, Bush Junior the president, Bush the plant. The more you can build up, that plant versus person is relatively easy for the software. They sort of, which one of the presidents, that requires probably more machine learning, right? So you're identifying these different entities. You build a model that you can either build from the default model, which is, comes along with Spacey, the software, or you can try to train it up with your own materials over time. It reports what it runs, again, to an SQLite database, which is very easy to query. Again, if anybody has skills in SQLite queries, anybody who's a database administrator, for example. And it also can dump. This is a feature that we added a bit later in the project through popular request. I think largely through state archives, is the sort of EML dump, right? Just dropping messages selectively out of the software, right? And so that's also something that we've added and is, you know, pretty well established in the software now. So again, you can use it at the command line. If you're familiar with the command line and you bring up a terminal, you can essentially type in, you know, the -H to find out more, and it'll tell you what all these commands are. And if you're not familiar with the command line, again, they look, you know, very unfamiliar, but basically the command line is always just saying, what is the command I'm going to do? What is the input? What is the output? And are there any special parameters, right? Like, do I want it to be more verbose, or do I want it to be recursive so it goes through folders? And so essentially, once you break it down, the tasks are pretty easy to see in the command line. So you can run this spacey entity recognition and then essentially see this output, which is these sort of text files that are the associated output. What we do, again, is write it to a database, because you don't want to read a bunch of text files, that then has this also quite simple table structure, which you know, you can see in the slides. I'm not going to elaborate on in a lot of detail, but basically the idea is to have a lot of information about both the messages and what we're done with the messages from a sort of provenance perspective, and then leave it in that database to be queried by a lot of different tools. So this is exploring the output of the Governor Kane test corpus, just running. You can see, for example, it identified these entities, right? Most of them are person entities, then organization, then date, then cardinal. You can go into one of those individually and see, okay, Gail was a big name, Marilyn. And you can see how these things could help you for when you see them in the aggregate. Oh, this is a name I need to look for, again, appraisal, review for sensitivity, description, whatever it might be. Because sometimes the ones that are really, really frequent pop to the surface, and then you can identify any kind of characteristics that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So this is, again, just showing the output in different ways where you can basically do these different queries. And we're sharing a variety of these sort of canned queries that you can run without having to write all this code yourself. We could say a lot later about code quality. I'll just essentially say what I said before, is that you know, our team, particularly on this project, especially building off of what Cam had already done for quality control, have built in all of these basically professional level, you know, sort of industry level is what I should have said, checks for the software in terms of making sure that it's solid code. So what I'm going to do now is turn over to that RATOM iterative processing web tool, which for many of you might be what you were waiting for the whole time, right? But I think that the background to all of it can be particularly helpful once you're thinking about, how do I integrate this into everything that's going on in my archives, and not just use of this tool, but I think the tool is pretty cool too. So anyway, I'll step back now.
So, so the RATOM appraisal tool, this is just a quick look at it. It allows archivists to review email materials for retention and or release with a user-friendly GUI. Users can view multiple email accounts at a time, a list of email messages within an account, as well as individual messages in an account. So users can then perform interactive reviews and tag email messages within these accounts. And users can also select messages as EML dumps for retention or for release. So there's basically like 3 major views. You can have the account view, like I said, the individual account view, and then message view. And so I'll just go through them right now. So here the main interface allows users to import and view multiple email accounts. You can see here there's multiple email accounts right here. Everything is in alphabetical order according to the account name. And each account displays inclusive dates for email messages within the account, a total number of messages within the account, and number of unprocessed email messages, and the date of the last modification made to the user, made by the user to the account. Hopefully you can see that there, but there's all the details right there. You know, if you click on this blue button here that says new account, what that allows you to do is to, it'll bring up a pop-up window, which allows you to import new email accounts and name them. The tool imports the email account from PSTs and performs entity identification via LibRatom, what Cal was talking about earlier. Account processing indicates complete when all the entity identification and full text indexing has happened.
is completed. And so, as I mentioned earlier, accounts can have multiple PSTs in there. And so here, if you look, there's the 3 dots. That'll pull down a menu that allows the user to either view or add files to the account. It'll give the option of add a file, which will allow the user to add files to the particular account. This is great. It's really useful when you're creating an account that has multiple PST files, as each PST file has to be added one at a time. It's also helpful for accounts from the same person that are transferred periodically over time. So whenever a new transfer is received for the same account, it can easily be added to the existing collection. By clicking the view option, clicking the view option, it'll open the email account and display a listing of the messages within the account. So you'll see this, the individual account view. Okay, so selecting an account displays an infinite scroll view of all the individual messages contained within the account. The top of the interface displays the user supplied account name. So whatever you had named the account is going to be there. And it also gives you the date range of the emails and the total number of emails. You will also see the number of unprocessed emails in the account. Each message listed displays its subject line, sender, green entity tags, and blue user-generated tags, which are not pictured here, and a status menu and the view button. So the status menu here is a drop-down menu that allows users to mark a message as open record, needs redaction, restricted, or non-record. Once a status is assigned to an email message, it's considered as a processed record. By default, all the messages are marked as unprocessed upon initial import. So status changes can also be made to the messages in bulk. To select all messages, you can go down to, you can check the box below, at the bottom of the screen there, and it will select all of the messages. To select a few messages, you can simply click on the little boxes, the check boxes next to each, at the left of each message subject. Once the user selects which records they wish to mark, a status menu will appear at the bottom of the screen, and the user can then designate the desired status. From the individual account view, you can also export processed accounts by clicking on Export as Records Request, which is located on the upper right-hand corner, and you see those blue words there. The user can choose to export either the selected email messages that fulfill perhaps the said records request, or all the messages if so desired. The selected records can be exported as a JSON file, which can then be converted into an EML file for retention or release. By clicking on the view button on the right side of an individual email message, users can view the contents of the email message. So this is the message view. So the message will appear in HTML format, but users can opt to view it in plain text format. You can just simply click that box there to view as plain text. And the view displays standard header information. You're going to get like all this standard header information, the to, from, subject, date, time, as well as the message body and file name of any associated attachment. The message view also displays the green LibreTom supplied tags. And then also you would, if we had blue user generated tags, they would also display at this time. At this screen, it's at this level, you have the option to generate and apply the additional tags to the message. So that would be, if there are any other tags you want to do. So like these tags would allow archivists, to better categorize emails in ways that might, for example, aid future records requests or to identify particular restriction classifications within the account. The record status drop-down menu is also included on this screen, if you see on the top right-hand corner. And that way you can also change the status of a record after reviewing it more closely by looking at the message content. So users can also use the search and filter functions in the left sidebar to refine their results. Available search functions include keyword search, label search, and email address search. Filters include folders, process status, record status, and date range. The keyword search will scan all email messages, including to, from, and subject headers. If entering multiple terms into the search will pull up any message that includes the entered terms. So if you're going to search something like Phillips Academy, you'd want to put it in quotes. Otherwise, you'll get the results will pop up anything with the words Phillips and Academy. The label search queries both green entity tags and the blue user provided tags already existing in the email account. So consequently, the search bar will autofill the user query with existing tags. Users can then select the desired green or blue labels they wish to search. The green entity tags can be particularly useful when seeking to limit results by persons or organizations. Users can also query the email account by email addresses. So this would include searching the message body, subject heading, sender, and recipient fields of every email message. Just a quick overview of the filters. Users can also filter search results by folder, process status, record status, and date range. Filtering by folders, excuse me, is possible whenever an email account has folders. So by clicking on add folders, under folders, a list of existing folders in the email account will display in a pop-up screen. User can then choose which folders to include in the search. Conducting searches folder by folder in cases of massive email accounts is another effective way to limit search results into a more manageable number. Filtering by folder also aids in understanding original order and what the user may have found important. To filter results by processing status and or record status, users can simply select which options they wish to view. So you can choose all, processed or unprocessed, open, restricted, needs redaction, or non-record. Notably, the sidebar displays how many records exist in each of those status categories. So if you can see it right there. Sorry, and the number updates accordingly every time a status is changed. In terms of iterative processing, filtering unprocessed email messages from processed ones, being able to do that is really useful whenever you take a break from processing an account. Finally, if you're being able to filter search results using date ranges is helpful for records requests that are meant to span a specific time period. The date filter will limit the search results in between those based on the date range you entered. And by default, the date range spans the dates of the entire email account. It will not search anything that is beyond the scope of the date range of the email account. All right. And lastly, audit history. The RATOM GUI tool also produces an audit history at the individual message level in the Django administrative backend. This ensures a clear record of initial processing action and potential changes over time. It also indicates the various changes individual users made on the message, which can be helpful if multiple users are processing the same account, which would probably happen in an iterative processing situation. Okay. So if you have any more, if you want to find out more information, here's a couple resources we have. And that's about all I have for the presentation. So we can do some Q&A now.
Yeah, don't be shy. And I should point out, I also put in the chat, just to acknowledge the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So we, kind of mentioned it really briefly at the beginning, but they are, that financial support has really brought this all together. In addition to, the sort of the SERI context that we're able to provide this in, as well as the work that the State Archives had done previously with the TOMS project, for example. So I think the lesson from that, one of the things, and I didn't really mention before, but I've worked in state government electronic records in the state of Kansas many years ago. And I just think that these kinds of connections are really what we need. And oh, sorry, State Archives considering, oh yeah. Sorry, so it's a question about what are your plans for actually implementing and using it?
Jamie, feel free to jump in. What I can say is, yes, we are hoping to use the tool. We're very much interested in using the tool. Right now, we're still in the midst of deploying it. So one of the things that's taken time, aside from just developing the tool, is just factoring in certain considerations, like, you know, so of course, like legal does not want, so we had Cactus, we had an outside group of developers developing the tool. And at this point, we have to, they helped us to deploy the tool. And so we're working on redeploying the tool and kind of Xing them out. And once we do that, then we can start using the tool, because legal has very strong restrictions about not allowing outside vendors to have access to our data. And at this time, we have no intention of, I mean, there's a workaround, but we are not planning to use Cactus as a full-time support. So right now we're just discussing it with IT and working through how to redeploy and take Cactus out of the equation so we can use it. But the short answer is yes, we do plan to use this tool.
Yeah, I think that's really a dynamic worth considering, at least from my experience, because I mean, you know, my first job as an archivist was soft money when I worked in Kansas. And I think just, you know, one of the biggest challenges in the environment when doing electronic records work, I think, is that so much is soft money in many cases, because that's how you can do something differently, right? Because you can get some resources. But it can be a real challenge to convince your IT support infrastructure people that this is now something you have to maintain, right? That if you're really fully committed to this, it's not just a project. The project was to demonstrate its value and to figure out how to use it and see whether it's going to help your workflows and all those sorts of things, right? So I mean, I know it's easier said than done, because I definitely know how hard it is to be done. But, you know, it's just, I think, a great conversation to have early on in the process and as often as you can, right? To just keep reinforcing we're not just playing around with this. This is something that needs to be supported to support our work over time. And so, you know, there are obviously various ways to do it. You could contract with somebody like Cactus to host it. You could host it yourself in terms of your own kind of, you know, your own archives, you know, servers and things. It could be at a higher institutional level. The biggest thing is just having the resources committed to doing that, right? Because this can basically, it's been designed to very well run at a lot of different levels in terms of the underlying technology. It's just, you have to know where to put it and who's going to maintain it. But anyway, I didn't know if you had anything to add to that, Sangeeta or Jamie, but.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I didn't see that question right away. So just for the recording, the question was, is NC State Archives considering using RATOM to process email collections outside this project, which you all just summarized. And I don't have much to add, just yeah, just that we're trying to figure out exactly what that's going to look like, but we very much would like to continue using it. And there was the link to our GitHub as far as like the deployment code that we're using. And you know, as Cal said, it may look different for different people depending on your resources and your IT and you know, what storage is available to you and that kind of stuff.
There is another question that I think only I can see, and it's when it connects to new accounts, does it have to be a live account in an email system, or can it upload already harvested data?
Mm-hmm.
So
yes, sorry, go ahead, Jamie.
So the way that, and I don't know if maybe there are other capabilities, but the way that we've been using it is with you know, PSTs or other files that have already been exported from an email system. So I don't know that I mean, we personally don't use it on live accounts. It's something that has been pulled out.
Right, and I would say quite frankly that this isn't, I mean, this existing configuration of tools, the underlying technology could really help you with that, but They just weren't designed for that particular use case of like, you know, pulling things live off of, you know, servers, you know. But certainly there are technologies to do that, to pull it out of Gmail, to use, you know, like SFTP and all those sorts of things. But anyway, I should also say that these are all great things that we'd love to discuss with people further. So feel free to reach out. If it's a very technical thing, we'd often defer to Cam and Antoine, but we love to get, you know, questions about it. Yeah, and I would just say again, I mean, I think there's a very general dynamic, which is that another thing about soft money is that you can often rely on someone else's infrastructure to do the initial work, which is really terrific because you can get started, which can be insanely hard in state government. But it then again also makes it really hard for you to kind of make the case. It's a really important thing to make the case that like that was just temporary. That doesn't prove we can do it without any support. It proves that we can test it out without any support. You know, because essentially, like us as a partner, we're doing research and development. Universities are in a generally terrible position to continue like maintaining software for somebody, right? It's not really what they do. And so what you get is that infrastructure, right? Because we were able to do things early on much, much more quickly because in the university environment, we basically just pay for it and bring up a server, you know? I mean, it's really easy because the infrastructure is there to support innovation and all this freewheeling crazy stuff that academics do. And so it made it much, much easier for us to get underway to do stuff within our technical infrastructure, which, you know, I don't think is trivial, but it means that essentially you're pushing on that discussion about how this is going to get supported, right? Because nobody who's running a research team can in any way commit to maintaining it over time or hosting it unless there's some kind of payment going on, right? Because anyway, just something to think about. Maybe this is obvious to everyone, but it's definitely been a lesson I felt like I've had to learn over the years. Were there other questions, I'm sorry, or, you know, comments that Jamie or Sangeeta had about that point? I just think sorry, were you going to say something, Sangeeta?
No, not really. I mean, I think, you know, I think something eye-opening for me was even just bringing, you know, the aspect of legal, working in government archives. That was something I had not foreseen, and how that would complicate. So sometimes it's not even a tech issue. It's like something like that, a legal restriction. So having to work around that was, for me, a great learning lesson.
Yeah, and I would say another thing is identifying test data, right? Because that's one of the challenges, because as you've kind of heard, these parallel environments going on, right? They could only use sort of dummy data, but the only way to really test it on your own collections is to have it running in your own environment. And so essentially, and we've experienced this, the team of, you know, Cam and me working on all of these projects for the past decade, a lot of this where essentially, I'm sorry, were you nodding your head, Sangeeta? Did you want to say something about that?
No, I would just add that, yeah. So, you know, we couldn't use our own data sets to test this. We were able to use, like, you know, the Jeb Bush files and Tim Kaine, I think, and I mean, Enron is out there. So, but it's using kind of the same things. And it was still fruitful to be able to do that. And we had other members of our archives doing that. And they were able to give us a lot of great feedback. But yeah, we are eager to get to the point where we can use our own data sets and work through things there. But yeah, so that was, yeah, again, I think for me, just understanding like the legal complications and then having to work around that was a big lesson.
And I think also you see all these pointers here, right? Several things lead to GitHub, and it can seem daunting if you don't normally go to GitHub, because it seems like, I mean, it's developed for developers, right? But it's starting to be used as a platform for a lot of different websites. And so even if you're not going there to dig into all of the little, you know, source code files and stuff, I'd recommend you look at the higher level resources, because, for example, we've really tried to troll around and identify what like data sets are out there that you could use, right, that don't have sensitivities. And we've sort of elaborated them there, right? So it might be helpful for you because it's just a dynamic you have to be thinking about. You can work with like, you know, imaginary collections for a while, and that's really, really helpful to figure out how is the technology going to work for me? How do I integrate the tools? You know, all those sorts of things. But when it comes to doing it on your own data, then obviously in a state archives context, it's, you know, it's a bit more challenging. So that's something as a development team we've faced through these decades of, this past decade of work, is just we've always had to rely on our own test data and then kind of advised institutions on how to do things within their own collections, right? So it's just a constraint that I'm sure you're all very aware of.
I will add too that, you know, the legal issue of test data was with Cactus, with the web interface development, but with the command line library, we were able to, you know, we could easily get that on our computers and run our data through that. So it was kind of that was also a workaround, because it would have been better for Cam and Antoine to be able to use some of our data, but we were able to and there was kind of a lag, because they'd be like, hey, here's a new release, try it out. And then I try it out, and then there may or may not be issues. But that was an advantage of the command line, was that it's easy to just get that and then run it through something. So at least for that part, we were able to use some of our own data. We at the State Archives were able to use it.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate, that's one of the things I've really been excited about with this project, because I feel like it's rare that you see essentially the developers and the users of the software as equal partners in a project, right? Because all of that back and forth and iterative conversations we've had are just essential to the work, right? Because we've really tried to tune it to what's going on in the state archives, and then hopefully, obviously, that will be relevant and useful in other state archives or other institutions. So we still do have a few minutes if there were other questions.
Here's another question. RATOM support account level export of processed email in a packaged format, for example, Mbox, for ingest into a preservation repository?
Right, so is the question about, for example, converting from PST to Mbox? Was that the idea? Or I don't know if we can get clarification on the question, or if that's going to be too cumbersome, but
I'm not sure if the question is about like individual email versus account level.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'll try to answer it, and please jump in the chat to tell me if this isn't what you were asking about. But essentially, yes, one of the primary things that we were really trying to do in this is create a very sort of reliable, testable, you know, open source and documented set of tools for I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I just don't recall what I was saying. Sorry about that.
So you can.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I'm sorry about that. A set of tools for pulling things out of PST files and OST files in particular, right? Because, for example, you may have encountered a lot of tools, as you're suggesting, that can pull in Mbox, or, you know, EPAD, for example, is one, right? It's sort of, they didn't specifically focus on purpose on that issue of that conversion. They just said, okay, start from Mbox and then you can use the software. So that's one way in which these can really complement each other, because basically you can use the software to go from PST to various forms of output, you know, Mbox, but you can also just, again, write it to a database that can include all of the content of the email to then export or query or whatever after the fact. And yes, in terms of dealing with individual messages or sets of them, that is, as I mentioned very briefly earlier on, one of the functions that we added with the command line interface is the ability to basically export in that way. You know, to be able to select these messages to output rather than output, you know, some other form, the EML files. And I will say this is a lot of hand waving. I guess I'm literally waving my hands, but This is a lot of hand waving in the sense that the hard problems with this are hard, right? I mean, it's just moving back and forth between like various flavors of mbox into other point, you know, like character representation can be off. It can fail to recognize headers in some cases, but we're usually talking about, you know, a few cases in hundreds of thousands or whatever, but it's just, you know, anytime you're doing conversion from one format to another, there's going to be some form of data loss that unfortunately you don't really know what it is at the time, right? That's the danger of migration. But, I mean, did that get to the question? Was that what someone was asking about?
Yeah, so we have a clarification. Bonnie says, we need to accession email, use tools such as RATOM or EPAD to process it, and then ingest the processed email into our preservation repository. If we used RATOM, could we pull aggregates of email out of RATOM and then ingest said aggregates into our repository?
Definitely, absolutely. That's exactly what it's been designed for. So I would encourage you to contact anybody you feel most comfortable contacting on our team to follow up, because, you know, it depends on, you know, are you using Preservica or Archivomatica, whatever it might be. We definitely are very open to that discussion, because that's the next step, right? It has very clear output. The question is, what form does that output need to take to be pulled into your environment? So the short answer is I would say absolutely, but the honest and longer answer is, if we talk about it more with you, we can figure out what's feasible, you know, because it's possible that you identify things that really just would require more software development work on somebody's part, but it's really terrific when we identify that, right? It's like, okay, now that's something that somebody needs to be charged with, somebody needs to be contracted with, that's part of a future project or whatever it might be. But yes, sorry, that was much more long-winded than it needed to be, but we're very interested in supporting that. That's really how we've designed the software from the start. So just let us know, you know, it could be anybody on the team, and we can try to sort of figure out what your case is and how we might be able to help with it. And I know I just sounded like a salesman, but all this software, once again, is free and open source. So we're not charging you any money for this. We actually do genuinely think it might be useful. But if you're ever part of a community around software, what's really valuable is that community around the software, because any software is broken in various ways, right? I mean, just software is a human product and it has bugs. The more you have a community around it, the more you can figure out what its limitations are, what the workarounds are. We've definitely seen that with the BitCurator Consortium, for example, with that software. There are huge numbers of issues with using any software like that, because it's very complex and has all kinds of functionality. A big part of it is having other people who might be using the software who you can kind of compare notes with. You can pull resources, because a lot of this is just writing scripts or things, right? If you know what to point somebody at and say, it has this database structure, I need to issue the queries because this is what I really want, is to export the headers and the attachments and whatever it might be, right? That's quite straightforward to do with the software and push it into your preservation environment. Once we know what the API is, and whether on the receiving end, the software that you'd be using for your preservation environment has certain constraints about what can be basically pushed in through its API. But in previous projects, for example, we've done work with both Archivomatica and Preservica about how to push data from a workflow into those environments. And I say we, our team, not the RATOM project, because that was with BitCurator software, but I mean, that's definitely a path that we followed before. Sorry, that was a very, very long answer.
If anyone is curious, and this might not be, you know, an exact technical understanding, but the at least with the PSTs, it assigns like a unique message ID to every email message, and then as you're processing, you know, in the web app, or I guess whatever you're doing in the command line, the JSON file that's kind of the like list of like, this is what I want to export, basically has those message IDs, and then LibRaTOM will pull those messages out based on the ID, I think. Does that sound right, Cal, if anyone is curious?
Yeah, definitely, yeah. Yeah, and it's essentially just, I mean, anybody who's familiar with database design, right, this is just basically we're identifying what those kind of queries are likely to be and structuring the database so that they're really straightforward to do, right? And so that's another thing. If the model behind it has limitations in some way, we'd love to hear about them, right? So for example, when working with Archivomatica and Preservica, we have heard back on this project, on the RATOM project, we've heard back from them about aspects of the documentation, more the sort of provenance, like, you know, when was this event and that sort of thing. They would like it to be right in the database because then they can pull it in to their preservation environments. And so that's something we added in, right? We shifted around the data model so that we had more documentation about what had happened with the software, because it's stored elsewhere by the software, but it wasn't built into the database. So those are the kind of things we're really open to. You know, how would it be easiest for you to push it into your preservation environment? Because it's just the right question. We are in no way offering this as a preservation environment. It's an environment for processing, reviewing, doing things with email, right? It really then needs to be put somewhere to be preserved. And this could include also pushing it to some cloud resource or something, right? It doesn't have to be downloading it to a specific machine.
So we've got about 2 minutes left if anybody has any last minute questions. Or comments.
Okay, well, I would again just love to thank, everybody who's made this possible and everybody on the team, including a couple you didn't get to see in this session, but are, sort of there in spirit. And to just point out that, in this kind of collective software endeavor that we're in, complaints are welcomed, right? And I don't mean like, oh, I guess I'll take them. The best sign of an active and useful body of software is a lot of bug reports, for example, right? Not bugs that are obvious because it's terrible software, but every software is going to have issues and feature requests and stuff. So please don't be shy about saying this seems really dumb and broken to me in some way, because that's actually a great benefit to us, right? It's not insulting us, it's telling us what we would need to do with the software, right? And that's really a communal thing. That's something the profession has to do. So. And I think we're up for it. I'm very excited how much we're up for it compared to 20 years ago when I started doing electronic records work. The budget's not better, but I think the knowledge and the technology has gotten better.
Well, we're at time, so thank you so much, Sangeeta and Cal, and everyone who was here in spirit. And thank you everyone for attending. There will be a brief survey evaluation that pops up as you exit, and we would really appreciate it if you can fill it out. And we do pay attention to feedback. And please keep your eyes peeled for future SERI webinars and other COSA offerings from the website and Twitter and Facebook. So thanks, everyone.